Okay, welcome back. This is Unit 8, and the next lecture is on some design issues. Two, actually. One is on focus and how focus relates to emphasis and dominance. But before that, I'm going to talk a little bit about um, visual pathways. But I just realized as I was loading the next lecture that I skipped the very last image on Gursky, and I think that this image, more than any other, represents how overwhelming Gursky's photographic work. And by the way, these are printed really large, and usually printed with backlight so that they have all this extra luminosity and just intensity. So there's that. But let's get on to the next lecture, which is, as I said, is on visual pathways. Okay, so if you look at this painting by Claude Lorraine, and it's a landscape painting, and I think we're going to start by talking about like landscape painting from the French Baroque, specifically on purpose because that landscape painting kind of represents this idea the most. One of the things that you can imagine as you're looking at this painting is that you can imagine that this painting is sort of designed as a journey, right? Like we have this set of figures here, but if we look, we can see the light kind of travel through. We can see a very kind of clear path. And then there's this river that has to be crossed, but it looks like that spot right there is just rocky enough you can get across it. And it's hard to see exactly how you go, but you can kind of imagine finding your path up here. And then you could see how that path would eventually, if you got through some of the stuff, would lead up there. Then you could cross that bridge and across there. Now you've gone from the foreground, right? And then you all this passage in the middle ground, and all this passage now to sort of this background. And then visually, if you got on a boat, you could even head to the even further distance of the far background if you wanted to. And the point I'm trying to make here is that when we look at paintings like this, these kind of landscape paintings, we quite often, the artist has done this on purpose, the pathway that we look at the work, our visual pathway, the pathway that our eyes see the work and move through it, are kind of paired up with the sort of narrative or the story pathway that a person in this space would walk, right? So that we go from the front distance to the back. Now, visually, there's more to it than that because there are certain places that our eye goes to, relatively early on. That, like, as we look at this, our eye often, for me, I actually find like I kind of enter the painting from this section up here. But of course, we're not expecting like the idea of the people to be climbing up there. And then where does this fit in, right? Our eye does go up there at a certain point as we're meandering through this picture. Like as we cross the bridge, we kind of look back up there a little bit before we then head further in that distance. So the metaphor has its limits, but the basic ideas, and let's look at this painting in more detail. So I've kind of cropped in a little bit, and we can look at that path a little bit more clearly. And you really can see that, yeah, you could cross that right there, sure. And there's some way to climb up here. Yeah, and then we'll get to that road back there. So, once again, the idea is that the pathway that the characters or the individuals or some person, even if the painting didn't have any people in it, the path that the people in the picture could walk is similar to the path that our eye walks, right? And here we have another painting that really makes this kind of explicitly clear. And this Watteau painting is so gorgeous. And once again, there are places that our eye moves to that aren't really part of that actual literal physical journey, right? But the idea of looking at an image, looking at a painting or a print, and it being a journey, this is definitely something that artists, especially starting in the Baroque, really started to think about. If we think about some of the earliest landscape paintings, like Bellini's painting is not really considered a landscape painting. It's very much about St. Francis and ecstasy, but nonetheless, the landscape space is a very important part of it. It very much tells us a lot about St. Francis, about him being removed from the city, about him being in wilderness. But once again, the journey through the landscape is very much kind of a part. It's almost like this idea of looking at this landscape and thinking about a journey that you would go through it to get to these distant spaces is the relief you get from the intensity of this, of St. Francis and his interaction with the divine force coming through that way. Or look at this painting by Giorgione. And many do claim that this is the first landscape, other than landscape studies, like the landscape study that I think we'll look at in a bit by Durr. Those studies are like either oil sketches or watercolor studies. But this is a finished painting, but it very much is where the landscape is part of the story. It's an allegory of some sort, but what is the allegory about? We're not entirely sure. But once again, our eye moves through the space, and the way our eye moves through the space is related to the way a person in this space would walk through it. So here's two more examples. So in the Rembrandt here, you very much can see that it's about like considering different kind of possible directions, that your eye could go this way or it could go up this way. And that once again, there are certainly places that our eye moves through, like this big cloud shape becomes a means also of leading us from this ending point, right, onto that next side over there. That way we can come back around by boat, maybe. Here's that Durr I was talking about. Once again, just by the nature of observing a landscape, the artist starts thinking about how do people think of getting from here to there. All right, here's another example of that. Now, we've looked at this painting before, and before we were really mostly just thinking about it in terms of the paint and the paint handling and just the beauty of the color. Van Gogh is truly a genius. But for right now, pause and think about how would we move through this, right? Where would we enter if we could imagine our path? I think most of us would either say that we're coming in this side, right? Because this is a big kind of primary focus that draws our attention, and then we're kind of walking through this way. Or some might say, no, I feel more like I enter here. But then almost everyone's going to feel like their path is at some point going to lead to here because it's got so much high contrast. Some might take a little detour right across there. And then almost certainly your eye moves. It might kind of view all of this for a bit, but then you hold on to something solid, which would be this tree line with these trees, and then they make that nice kind of scale shift back towards that horizon line, and that gives us another structure to hold on to. So there's a journey that our eye moves through. And this kind of idea works in not just landscape paintings, but in paintings that are very different, paintings that aren't, that are kind of harder to read. Even in a painting like Guernica, right, we have more distant sort of spaces that are this open doorway, right, and looking about that way, or that window right there. We have more distant spaces that our eye moves to. And then there are these clear sort of paths that our eye moves from one area to another. And that we can, as we're looking at this, we can have this clear sense that we have places where our eye rests, right, like in this area, right? And we have certain areas where our eye moves, certain areas where our eye will enter the composition. I think for a lot of people, the sword is a strong one. And then places that our eye kind of moves towards and ends. This is probably a very challenging version of this idea, to think about how does our eye move through it. But even a painting like this, if you really slow down and take your time, you'll realize that your eye doesn't look at it as a whole. It's impossible to look at it as a whole. Instead, your eye kind of scans it. And to a certain degree, because it's so hard to read, I think our eyes scan it a little bit circularly at first, but then we kind of start to zoom in on things that stick out to us and then start noticing interactions. This way that our eye moves through this type of visual pathway is much more complex and much more ambiguous, meaning that like it's different, slightly different at least, but usually majorly different from person to person compared to the visual pathway of a work like this, right? Which is very, very clear as to where is the entry point, where our eyes can be moving to, where are the different kind of focuses that our eyes can be moving on to. But nonetheless, this still has a visual pathway, and that if you pause and really think about it, you can see that the artist has thought about how are our eyes directed through it.